Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Did you guys know we had a Twitter? Well, you should check it out. The handle is right here. The clone troopers and their story remains one of the most popular parts of Star Wars lore. There's something immediately very likable about these copy and paste soldiers. Despite their terrible lot in life and tremendous hardship and suffering, these clones had a very optimistic outlook on life and should be commended for their steadfast loyalty to the Republic. They are also some of the best trained troops in the galaxy, fearless, disciplined, and very objective-oriented. While the Republic seemed to take these clone troopers for granted, some of the individuals that actually trained them did not. When Jango Fett was approached to be the template for the entire clone army, he took on a larger role than just being a DNA donator. Legends say he was also put in charge of finding the trainers for the entire Clone Army Special Forces Division. And he was a pretty good choice. More than a decade earlier, Fett had been put in charge of the true Mandalorian Super Commandos, who functioned like an elite PMC task force. They had their own logistics, vehicles, and even dropships and carriers. They were perhaps one of the deadliest forces in the galaxy, and Jango, who already was sworn to secrecy about the whole Kaminoan cloning project, was already on the payroll anyway. And so he set off to find some of the most talented soldiers in the galaxy, who also happened to have the ability to train and lead other men. He ended up selecting 100 different individuals, mostly mercenaries, assassins, and bounty hunters, and 75 of them were also Mandalorian. This group of extremely talented men and women were called the Cuy'val, which in Mandoa means those who no longer exist. They were paid a ton of credits up front, and also probably forced to sign an NDA, and became the trainers of 100 groups of clone commandos. A decade later, with the Clone Wars in full swing, Jedi Master Arlechin Zay, director of the Grand Army of the Republic's Clone Special Forces Division, said the following.
I think it's significant that the casualty rate among commando squads trained by the Mandalorians is lower than those trained by other races. Somehow Mandalorians imbue their charges with a sense of purpose, self-confidence, and almost obsessive sense of clan, of family. That gives them a genuine survival advantage. Let us be thankful they're on our side this time.
Like most Jedi, Master Arlechin Zay was not a fan of the Mandalorians. He thought they were a bit too eager to fight and kill. But he was a fair man, and he noticed that the individuals being trained by the Cuy'val members that were Mandalorian seemed to do a lot better in combat. So let's take a look at the Mandalorians' culture and why it was perfect for the clone trooper. When the 75 Mandalorians of the Cuy'val first met their clone trainees, they weren't looking at full-grown clones. Instead, the Cuy'val were looking at 4-year-olds who were biologically only around 2 years old. The clones were made to age twice as fast as the normal human being in order to save time on production costs. The Mandalorians might have been extremely rough and violent men and women, used to death and cruelty, but as a group, they've always had a soft spot for babies and children. And that's because a decent amount of Mandalorians were actually adopted straight off of the battlefield, usually orphaned by the very operations carried out by the Mandalorian fighters. Jango Fett had been found in this way by Jaster Muriel. Another prominent Mandalorian, Cal Skirata, was also found in this similar way, as was the Mandalorian, who himself then passed it forward by adopting a baby Yoda instead of killing it or handing it off to Imperials. And so these Mandalorians who first saw these miniature Fett clones didn't just see little soldiers that they needed to train, they saw human children that needed to be protected, nurtured, and raised up like normal human beings. This especially became apparent when the Mandalorians first met the Kaminoan scientists in charge of the program. The Kaminoans were a godless race of sociopaths obsessed with genetic superiority and completely saw the clones as just products. This meant that in the earlier days, these Kaminoan scientists would slaughter and execute entire batches of clones that had defects. And when I say defects, I meant things like having a rebellious streak or some other personality quirk, which is completely normal for human beings to have. The Kaminoans had staved off their own extinction when their planet's oceans rose by aggressively culling the weakest members of their society. And the Mandalorians thought they were cowards and generally hated their guts. As a matter of fact, some of the Mandalorians daydreamed about capturing one of these scientists, killing them, and then barbecuing them, and then eating their flesh, and then making some nice gloves out of their skin. The Mandalorians were able to quickly see the potential and natural goodness these clones had inside of them. They knew that the Fett clones would make terrific soldiers and human beings if they had a chance to grow up. Mandalorians were uniquely trained for teaching children how to become warriors, because in Mandalorian culture, a huge part of parenting was also training their children to become fighters. Like the Spartans or Comanches, the Mandalorians were first and foremost a warrior race. Their main source of income was fighting as contractors. A Mandalorian who didn't know how to field strip a blaster and hit a moving target from the back of a moving speeder would be similar to a Comanche who didn't know how to fire an arrow from the back of a horse, or a Spartan who didn't know how to make love to a small boy. So each Mandalorian trainer had a very unique relationship with the 100 or so clone commandos underneath their command. Some trainers, like Cuy'val, were extremely demanding and cruel to his clones. He once nearly beat one of his commandos to death. Val believed in preparing his clones for the very worst that combat had to offer, so his training was pretty extreme. But he still cared about his clones tremendously, he just showed it in a very strange and weird way. As a result, his clone commandos had an even higher survival rating than most. Then there were trainers like Cal Scarada, a man with a massive heart who took in each clone and treated every one of them like his biological son. Even when his contract ended with the Republic, he would find ways to continue working alongside them, and spent his life trying to create a home for the clones after the war and also cure their advanced aging. Whether it was Cal or Waylon, every Mandalorian trainer made sure to teach their clones the Mando way. The same thing actually happened with non-Mando trainers as well. The Corellian trainers would teach their clones Corellian culture, and the Alderaanian trainers didn't exist. They were too busy painting landscapes and having philosophical debates about whether it was okay to hook up with your sibling if you didn't know you were related to them. So why did Mandalorian culture help make clone commandos much more efficient than their non-Mandalorian trained counterparts? Well, the biggest problem with the clone training program and how the Kaminoans modified the Fett DNA was how uniform and collective they made the clone troopers. The Kaminoans removed the most aggressive and individualistic parts of Jango Fett and replaced it with a much more agreeable personality. And so the Fett clones were physically and mentally tough, but on an individual level not as creative or free-thinking. Some might say they were downright predictable. As a matter of fact, during the Battle of Anaxes, the Separatists were able to capture the clone trooper Echo and use his brain to create an algorithm that could predict all of the clones' tactics. Now, this lack of creativity was fine for your rank and file clone who fought in massive formations on massive battlefields where it was quite hard for the individual clone to understand their role, let alone make decisions on what they were doing. But the clone commandos fought well behind enemy lines in small four-man groups. These clones would constantly be outnumbered and in extremely challenging and dangerous situations. Situations that one really can't train for, and situations that required quick-thinking individuals who are ready to adapt and continuously put themselves in an advantageous position. Oftentimes, these units would have to split up into smaller groups, so each clone had to think like an individual. And so this is what made the mercenaries, assassins, and bounty hunters of the Cuy'val perfect for this job. There are no other professions that are more individualistic. Mandalorian culture was also extremely focused on individuality. They were basically the Libertarians of the Star Wars galaxy. Aside from the Mandalorians didn't have a real chain of command when they entered battle. Generally, the most experienced soldier took charge and everyone just listened. There were also no regulated uniforms, standardized arms, or official structure to their military force for most of their history as well. They essentially functioned like an Indian raiding party with very little logistics and support. The Mandalorians were also prolific fighters who continued to hone their battle skills throughout their entire life. Their order had very few rules outside of their vague code and traditional armor. They were relatively open-minded when it came to tactics and technology. They didn't really care how you won a fight as long as you won the fight. They saw battle not as something you just had to survive. Instead, they saw it as almost like an art form, something that needed to be perfected throughout one's lifetime. The Mandalorians were constantly focused on battle, and when they weren't fighting, they were obsessing over weapons and new mods and attachments, cleaning or decorating their armor. They were as much gearheads as they were warfighters, which is also why a lot of clones would carry all sorts of non-regulation weapons, like the Verpine Shattergun. The Mandalorian culture helped the clone commandos realize that the rules and bureaucracy set in place to control the clone army need not apply to them. Because of the type of missions they faced, they couldn't really follow traditional rules of engagement. Because of the type of enemies that they faced, they couldn't go through the normal Galactic Republic way of procuring equipment or vehicles. They had to just basically buy it all on their own. The The Mandalorians were also extremely good at making money, so that wasn't all that difficult. By the end of the Clone Wars, Cal Skirata had turned a sizable amount of credits seized in missions by the clones into a massive fortune thanks to some smart investments on the Galactic Stock Exchange. These funds were going to be used to provide a home for all the clone commandos who survived the war. And so what you had were clone commandos who looked like clones but operated very much like Mandalorian super commandos, which drew the ire of the director of the Special Forces and other more traditional senior commanders in the Grand Army of the Republic. But the clone commandos' results were always fantastic. There were hardly ever missions that they couldn't accomplish. As a matter of fact, they were usually sent on missions that were reserved for Jedi teams, showing us just how valuable and competent they were. The clone troopers had a pretty raw deal. No real family, no retirement plan, and forced servitude. But what made things acceptable for them was the fact that they fought beside individuals they considered their brothers. They might not have fully understood what the Galactic Republic was, they might have never seen all the core world civilians living in peace thanks to their actions, but that was fine because to them, the Galactic Republic and all the clone troopers were their extended family, and that made it worth fighting for. The Mandalorian trainers, however, added another layer to that identity. The clone commandos beneath their command learned how to speak Mandoa. They learned about Mando culture and their way of life. They learned about the Kama, a traditional garment made out of flame-retardant material and used by Mandalorians to shield their legs from their jetpack exhausts. They learned how to honor their dead in the Mandalorian way and how to sing Mando songs on their way to the battlefield. They also painted their helmets with war stripes and various colors. Suited up in their bulky Tarn armor, they would have been a terrifying sight on the battlefield. The Kaminoans, with all of their research and data, were able to create what they thought was the perfect soldier. A soldier is an individual who is designed to fit into a larger military campaign and follow orders. But what the Mandalorians were really good at was making the ultimate warrior. A warrior might be more individualistic, they might not follow orders in the same way a soldier will, but in individual combat, no one can really defeat a warrior. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.